So Joshua and I hadn't met before today, but it seems like in some ways our talks are inverses of each other, because my talk is also really a talk about scale and a talk about the consequences of a lot of small actions on larger both temporal scales and also spatial scales. And like Josh, I start out with a kind of personal story and talk about the trajectory of my own research and how it comes to put me here in a situation like this. So sometime around 30 years ago, a little more than 30 years ago, I won't say how much more, as a beginning graduate student, I was asked to join a research project in India. And I joined a project studying the archaeological remains of the city of Vijayanagara in southern India. It was the capital of a huge empire that controlled most of southern India between the 14th and 16th century, a period we sometimes refer to as the medieval or middle period. And it was a great opportunity to go to the field and do research. But really the main reason, I think, that I agreed to go to this work at this really fabulous site in one of the hottest and driest parts of southern India was the fact that I was a very big fan of Indian food. And my best friend in college, mother, was a tremendous cook, and I used to eat her cooking all the time when I was an undergraduate, and I expected that I would get that marvelous Indian food when I went to the field in southern India. And when I got to the field, it was a little different than what I had expected. South Indian food is quite distinctive from the North Indian food that most Americans experience in restaurants here. And what I came to realize that the food that we were served in camp, was not quite as nice as this thali, is a particular sort of cuisine. So the South Indian meal is often referred to as a thali, which is a word referring to the plate. And the plate can either be something like a banana leaf, like you see here, or a metal plate with a lot of little bowls. And the plate itself is a kind of metonym for the meal. The center of the South Indian thali is rice. All of the other kinds of dishes that occur around it are vegetables, pulses, bananas, things with coconut in them, dairy products. All of these are products, except for dairy products, of intensive, cultivated, and especially irrigated agriculture. So the thali itself represents a very particular type of meal, a very elite form of consumption, as I came to realize. So the kind of meals that we were having in our excavation camp were very like, in many ways, the meals that the people who lived in this vast medieval city themselves were eating in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, or at least some of the people who lived in that medieval city. Besides the kings, the merchants, and the other kind of wealthy people who ate South Indian rice-based and irrigated product-based thalis, the other big consumer of this kind of elite cuisine were the gods. South Indian temple complexes in the medieval period were very large affairs. They had kitchens, they had huge staffs, they often owned significant amounts of agricultural land, and they fed very many people, including the god or goddess as well. And like elite humans, gods enjoyed the same sort of food and preferentially rice-based cuisines. So we can see this in very graphic material form in, for example, these kinds of stone thalis that we find sometimes in temple complexes that look exactly like the kinds of meals that people are still eating. The big round plate with the small bowls and the kind of central place accorded for these products of intensive irrigated agriculture. Quite fantastic. And it wasn't too hard to figure out, working in the city itself, right on the banks of the Tungabhadra River, one of the few perennial rivers in southern India, where all of those irrigated products came from. As you can see here in this picture, there are still fields that are watered by canals and by aqueducts that were built in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. So these are still fields that are under production, and they grow, guess what? They grow rice, They grow vegetables, they grow bananas, they grow sugar cane, all the same kinds of things that go into the elite tali. And one of the other consequences of this, just a foreshadow I'll say before, is also this obviously represents massive environmental transformation of the landscape, right? So this is one of the driest parts of southern India. After I spent many years working in the city of Vijayanagar itself, documenting all these archaeological remains, for my own dissertation project, and for many, many years later, I moved out from the city in order to look at the larger regional context. So we're expanding now from the scale of a single city to the scale of a particular region, but we're on a relatively short kind of temporal span, only about 300 years. When I went out to look at the area outside of the city and study how the environment had been transformed, how agriculture was organized, I found a completely different universe, right? A universe of dry farming, a universe of a very precarious universe in which agriculture is extremely risky and very problematic. So it's supported either only by rain, less than 50 centimeters per year, or by runoff-fed reservoirs like you see here. And you can see us standing up on top of it, actually, documenting it. These runoff-fed reservoirs are very impressive-looking kinds of features, but they actually have very, very high failure rates. And the life of a farmer out in these rural, dry areas is extremely precarious. What we also see archaeologically and in the historical documents too is that the kinds of foods that are associated with the areas outside of the intensive irrigated zone are completely different, right? So unlike the rice-based tali sitting on a banana leaf that you see here on the right side of the slide, the food of ordinary people is based on millets instead of rice, dry-farmed grains. There's none of the kinds of extras, the coconut, the banana, the other kinds of things, all of these irrigated crops. No bananas at all, in fact, either as a plate or on the plate. So we see a very different kind of way of life and very different modalities of consumption, just to sort of refer back to Joshua's talk in a minute. These differentiated cuisines then, as we came to know over the course of several hundred years, themselves created differentiated physical landscapes. And the landscapes were affected in various kinds of ways. They were affected in terms of the nature of soils, of the nature of slopes, of vegetation, and also in terms of the kinds of biodiversity that we find in those contexts. So what we see here is that the kinds of not only food choices, but the kinds of power relations that exist between people have significant environmental consequences that ramify through the generations. So it's not very original or shocking, I think, to an audience like this to make the point that our food choices have consequences. This is a message that we're bombarded with, in a sense, every day. But to get back to the question of scale again for the moment, it's very easy to think that one small choice can't really have that much impact on the larger system. And in a kind of straightforward empirical sense, that's certainly true, right? But food choices, like other kinds of choices of consumption, many small choices add up to make a big decision. So the work that I did studying the development of elite cuisines in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century then led to another research project, which I won't tell you all about the much longer-term trajectory of this kind of differentiated food system and these differentiated landscapes that emerged in southern India, this time over the last 5,000 years. So it felt like we were really doing something kind of special then, in a way, looking at really long-term changes and what impacts those have on the landscape. But 5,000 years and one little piece of southern India, again, it's actually kind of small potatoes, really. So if we think about what the longer-term impacts of these kinds of food choices, including the things like the production of irrigated rice, then we have to, again, change our spatial scale quite considerably. And this is a map. This is Earl Ellis's map of global, what he calls anthromes, that is, various kinds of anthropogenic environments across the earth right now, today. And you can see in this particular map, it's not a historical map, it's of what's happening now, rice and rice villages are in a kind of an alarming blue color, right? So if we think that rice and the production of rice paddies has a particular impact on the Earth system, you can see that this is not an inconsequential kind of impact. What kind of impact do things like irrigated rice have on the Earth system? Obviously, there are changes in vegetation. And these typically become permanent field systems, so there's no regrowth of woody vegetation, so there are changes in carbon sequestration, changes in albedo that are always associated with the kinds of vegetation transformations of agricultural production. But also rice paddies and taro pond fields are special in a way because they produce methane, which is a greenhouse gas. So what has been the long-term impact of the expansion of rice and rice agriculture in Asia and elsewhere on not only humans and human cultural systems and the distribution of power relations within human societies, but also on the Earth system itself? This is something that my students and I began worrying about quite specifically. So again, we expanded our spatial scale. So from 5,000 years and a focus on Southern Asia, we began to worry more about a period of about 10,000 years, that is the Holocene, since the beginning of human agriculture and for the whole globe. So I began work co-directing an international scientific working group called Land Cover 6K, which is a kind of a as I think I told the reporter who asked about it, an insanely ambitious effort to document not only vegetation change for the last 10,000 years for the globe, primarily by looking at pollen analysis as a proxy record of past vegetation. Vegetation obviously is very important for the Earth system, particularly in terms of carbon cycling and albedo, but other things as well. But also looking at the changes in human land use and their relationships to vegetation, because that's very much a black box often in how we think about the human impact on the Earth. And many people say things about whether people have or have not had a very significant impact on the Earth over the last 10,000 years since we started domesticating plants and animals. But the truth is we have very poor empirical evidence about what exactly the nature of that impact might be. So in this group, we are working with climate modelers, we're working with ecologists and biologists, but quite unusually, it also includes a large number of archaeologists, historians, and historical geographers. And we're working to aggregate, to commiserate, and to synthesize the actual empirical evidence of basically past human history, both land use and then also land cover, vegetation, for the Earth in ways that will be useful for global climate models. So we've gone, in a way, kind of full circle in this discussion, and really for me in my own research trajectory, from a very small scale, very kind of intimate level of analysis to 10,000 years in the entire globe. We've gone, in a sense, from the plate to the planet, as it were. So when we think about food, it's a very small scale, in a way, a very intimate kind of thing in the matter of consumption. Although, as Joshua pointed out, it's not so much like that when we think about it in terms of the global food system. But it's clear that many small choices can have a significant impact. And it's very difficult for us, I think, to think about these kinds of multiple spatial scales, not only spatial scales, but even more so, I think, these multiple temporal scales, to think about how we've gotten to this point and what kinds of relationships, what kinds of processes have got us there. Okay, that's it.
How have these realizations affected you and your colleagues' food choices now?
Yeah, when I talk about rice and the differences between elite rice-based cuisines and sort of the foods of the poor and millet, particularly in the U.S., where the dynamics of agricultural production are very different. There's always a dinner after the talk, and then people say, oh, I'm really sorry, there's rice for the dinner. Or if they didn't listen, then they say, you know, we served rice because we know you're really interested. I think for everybody, you know, we do what we can. And I will say, you know, just as an individual human being, and not so much as a scholar, and as a professor at the University of Chicago, I have 3 community garden plots at 62nd and Dorchester, and 2 at 65th and Kimbark. So I grow a huge amount of my own food, I'm happy to say, in my community gardens, and that's organically. So I think that's something. But the other thing about the community garden, of course, is the community part of it, right? So I think that when we think about issues like food, we can't separate them from the kinds of cultural context, from the context of power, and relations of, you know, access to resources and cultural specificity, right? Because people make food choices not only as some kinds of, rational actors in a kind of economist sense, but they also make choices that make sense to them culturally and in terms of their particular situations in the world. And that makes the world a very complicated place.